Let me ask you a personal question. Do you look forward to family get-togethers? Do you really like them? Or are there just sometimes, maybe more often than not, that you would just rather skip them altogether? Some people actually regret how they become when they talk and act around their extended family. Maybe you've had thoughts like this woman who said, "I'm a grown woman, but I act like a child and bicker anytime I get around my family." Or, "I know it shouldn't bother me, but my parents always favored my brother over me." Or, "None of my siblings are speaking to me, but they sure are talking about me." Now, if you do or ever have had a difficult time relating to your extended family, you're not alone. You're not alone. Many people have a difficult time dealing with their family of origin, dealing with the people with whom they grew up in their very tender childhood years. In his little book, Family Feuds, Timothy Lane writes as follows. He says, "Why is it so hard to get along with your family? Deep hurts from your childhood, unrealistic expectations, and old patterns resurfacing are just some of the reasons you might find yourself in a family feud." Now, this was the case for ancient Israel as well. Yes, it was. Israel was in a family feud. She feuded nonstop with her cousins, the Edomites. And we are going to learn about this sad family feud in the little book of Obadiah. So this brings us to our first point tonight. Who is Obadiah? Well, Obadiah is what we call a minor prophet. Of the 12 books found in the minor prophets of the Old Testament, the most minor of the minors is Obadiah. No, it's not because his theme and message is unimportant. It's because he's the shortest of all the minor prophets. He writes a little book that is 1 chapter long with 21 verses. Also, we actually know very little about the prophet Obadiah. He is rather anonymous. We do not know when he was born. We do not know where he was born. We don't know the name of his daddy. We don't know what he did to make ends meet. We do not know. There are about a dozen Obadiahs mentioned in the Old Testament, so tracking down those names won't always help. But we do know a simple fact about him, and it's that his name, Obadiah, means servant of the Lord. And perhaps that's all we need to know. In fact, God ordained, it's about all we know. Scholars estimate that he wrote this book around 587 BC, for that is the year, a year that would live in infamy, the year that Jerusalem would fall to the Babylonians. You know, I can't help think as I read the book of Obadiah that Obadiah's anonymity is actually a spiritual lesson, a spiritual symbol, a metaphor. Obadiah represents all the anonymous servants of God who've served throughout the age of the church. For example, have you ever noticed that sometimes things are going well at church? Yes, when things go well at church, it's pretty fun. The deacons are smiling, bills are being paid. The elders are smiling, the congregation's growing. The people are smiling. Many are being saved and healed and overcoming sin. And then it happens. One of the parishioners walks up to the pastor and says, "Pastor, you're pretty good." And it's at that moment that a very wise pastor will just smile and say, "Well, I'm glad God knows the truth." Because you see, there's the other time when things are going poorly at church. Sometimes it happens. The church is shrinking. Money is not there. People aren't professing faith. Baptisms are in short supply, and the people might walk up. Maybe the very same person who walked up last year walks up this year and says, "Pastor, you're the problem." And a wise pastor will just smile and say, "I'm glad God knows the truth." Because fact is, dear church, God's servants, by and large, are anonymous people. In general, the vast majority of God's leaders, of his people over the centuries, very anonymous, like Obadiah. Obadiah's our man. He's every man's pastor. We do not know who he was, what he did, or how he did it. All we have are a handful of verses he wrote. But that's often the kind of anonymity you find in God's servants in every generation of God's people. And I think that when we get to heaven one day, we'll get to meet some of those as we get together, and maybe you see that one or two pastor that was highly praised and got a lot of credit and stood tall on earth. Well, maybe he'll be off quietly sitting in a shack somewhere in heaven one day while the faithful anonymous servants of God shine like the sun, shine like Obadiah. All right, this brings us to our second point, and that is the Edomites. The Edomites. Now, there's one other reason Obadiah is a minor prophet, and his book is a minor one, and that's because most Christians know such little about the book and know such little about the very tribe, the nation, the tribe nation addressed in this book. And that tribe, that nation was the Edomites. Now, some of you maybe aren't into history, maybe learning about all of those Canaanite tribes near and around, maybe don't appeal to you. Maybe you come to church tonight and you've got a lot on your mind. You're thinking, "Pastor, I've lost my job. Pastor, my marriage is in trouble. My kids are rebelling. I'm not even sure if there is a God anymore." Please know history lessons about the Edomites. Now stick with me, dear church, because God puts things in the Bible that are important. They are genuinely helpful reasons that God speaks about the Edomites in the book of Obadiah. Let me explain. A pastor friend of mine years ago once told me about an African safari he went on. And on that safari, his group approached this lion on the Serengeti who was feasting on an animal that another predator had killed. Once that lion got his fill, then he allowed the mother lion to have her share. Meanwhile, the cubs were nearby, patiently waiting for their turn for the lions to finish up. And then on the outer ring was a circle of buzzards and hyenas, all waiting for the lions to finish their meal. And those describe Edom. They were hanging around to see what they could get out of Israel after God judged them. The Edomites were scavengers. Scavengers. You'll look on a geography map in the 7th century BC, and you'll notice that Edom lived, pretty near Israel. They lived just below Israel to the south and the west. They lived in the hill country and a mountain region of Seir. We'll learn more about that in the famous geography found there today. But back to the summary, Edom had a long-standing family feud with Israel. it went back a long time, a millennia and a half. It started way back in the days of the patriarchs, in the second half of Genesis. There was a patriarch who had a son whose name was Isaac, and Isaac had two sons named Esau and Jacob. Well, the children of Jacob were the 12 tribes, the people of Israel and Judah. However, the children of Esau were the Edomites, the children of Esau. Let me tell you what, trouble brewed early on between those two boys from day one. Esau and Jacob did not get along. Rebekah, their mother, knew that trouble was brewing when she received this prophecy in Genesis 25:23. It said, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Well, that spells trouble. Jacob turned out to be a deceiver, a trickster. And his mother wasn't that wonderful either. Jacob and Rebekah used trickery regarding Esau's birthright. Esau offered it to Jacob in a fit of hunger, but then things got worse. See, the day came when it was time for Isaac to bless his oldest son Esau, but even then, Isaac got tricked by Rebekah and Jacob and ended up giving the blessing to Jacob as prophesied. Now, these 2 sons did get together at the funeral of their father, but the truce did not last. And even though you read about the very historic and heroic efforts made by Jacob to reconcile himself to Esau, Esau remained bitter. And what happens when 2 cousins, now who become 2 uncles, grow bitter with each other? Well, the cousins get bitter. And what happens when the cousins get bitter? The second cousins get bitter. And, well, we could keep going. It became a family feud. All right, now, fast forward from that event 500 years, half a millennia, and that first generation was gone. Esau and Jacob. Their family feud would seem to have been buried with them in their graves. But, oh no, the tribes did not forget. The tribes of Esau and Jacob did not forget. The family feud took on a life of its own. So it happens that 500 years later, Moses was leading God's people to the promised land. And they had suffered God's people for 40 years in the wilderness, and they made a simple request to Edom. It was only a small amount of help they needed from Edom. But in order for them to get to the place they were going to, they needed to cross through Edom. That was it. So they approached the Edomites, and they asked, can we pass through? Listen to their words in Numbers 20, verse 17. It says, please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory. What was the answer? Well, verse 18 will tell you. It continues the story, but Edom answered, you may not pass through here, and if you try, we will march out and attack you with the sword. So verse 19, what happened? The Israelites replied, we will go along the main road, and if our livestock drink any of your water, we will pay for it. We only want to pass through on foot, nothing else. And what did the Edomites say? You may not pass through. Over the next 900 years, the Edomites joined the enemies of Israel 5 times to invade them, to sack them, and to plunder them. And now, as we begin our study of the book of Obadiah, the Edomites, they're doing it again, this time with the Babylonians. So let's pause just for a moment. Now, I plan to talk more about the Edomites in future sermons, but I want to finish tonight's introduction with a final point. And it's a final warning. It's a final warning that none of us in this room are immune from. Beware of bitterness. Be careful when you fight. I know sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you should be angry, but you got to sin not. You see, fights create a lot of energy, and that energy's got to go somewhere. Fights produce many ripples in our lives. Are you tracking them? Fights are like throwing pebbles in a pond. Have you ever done that? You throw a pebble in a pond and you watch the ripples in concentric circles grow and grow and grow, and before you know it, uncountable the number of ripples. Sometimes the ripples of pain and grief and devastation from a family fight last for years, decades, centuries. So, dear church, that is why, as followers of Christ, it's so important to be faithful in your small conflicts in life. Be faithful so that God can make those moments a monument to his glory, not a pillar of pain. Every choice we make has a future consequence. Every act we choose has a future repercussion. Every pebble makes a ripple for a while. And so I give you Hebrews 12, verse 15. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness grows up and causes you trouble, or many of you will become defiled. Now, I think the root of bitterness is more dangerous than many of us realize. Take our own community. I remember when I moved here 23 years ago, and I was so excited because recently our community had been placed on a list of the top 100 places in America to raise a family. And here I was coming with a family of 5 children and 2 adults, 7. And among many reasons given even in that study is the fact that it's a very stable community. People settle here and they stay here. But do you know, with every blessing in this fallen world, right, there's always a corollary, a dark side. What that means in our well-established community is that there are family quarrels that go back 3 and 4 and 5 generations. In fact, maybe you're in one right now and you don't even know why. You don't know why you have ill will towards that family or that church or those cousins. You just do. And as silly as it seems to us when we see other people quarrel, it's not as silly when you're the one doing the quarreling. Then it doesn't seem silly. In fact, I found as a pastor, we ministers can preach great sermons, warning against bitterness, warning against quarreling. We can tell you in a sermon that bitterness will kill you on the inside. It'll harm your joy in the Lord. It will ruin your witness to your neighbor. And then we ministers turn around and get angry and turn around and become bitter. And suddenly, we have a different view of bitterness because it's ours, not others. The truth is, and Obadiah is going to show us in this sermon series, that bitterness starts in the heart and it can go on for generations. And it really hurts and destroys God's people. And that is why Jesus said it is so important to forgive as we have been forgiven. So, dear church, if there's someone who really makes you angry right now, you can hardly say their name. Do something about that. You're going to die one day. And whatever residual bitterness you leave behind, it will affect your kids, your grandkids, and their kids. Address bitterness now. For the ripples can cause all kinds of disruption for years to come. Whether it's a family member you can't stand, whether it's a church member you don't like, whether it's a whole denomination that makes you spitting mad, beware of bitterness. Remember Edom. Well, let's close tonight's intro sermon. Timothy Lane concludes with this thought from that same book, Family Feuds. He says, it is possible. Is it possible to love in the midst of these challenges? Yes, with God all things are possible. Change begins with taking an honest look at your family and yourself, hearing what God has to say about your struggles, and then trusting Jesus to help you love in a difficult situation. May God grant grace to his church not to repeat the sin of Edom towards God's people, and that all God's people say, amen.